Hello and welcome to Week 8 of FINA H111, History of Art 1, Prehistory to Medieval. This is a course presented by Indiana University, Purdue University of Fort Wayne. I'm Dr. Aaron Schwartz. Week 8, our topic is Late Antiquity. This will cover the period of time after the collapse of the Roman Empire and Constantine's rule to the beginning of the medieval period in Europe. Lots of stuff going on, lots of interesting art traditions that will serve the foundation for later European art production. So without any further introduction, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to do is look at this timeline, and I don't usually do this. I don't usually put timelines on these presentations, but given that this time period we're looking at, the late antique, is kind of a transitional period from the collapse of the Roman Empire proper and the development of the Holy Roman Empire and medieval Europe, I thought it was important for us to locate ourselves chronologically and have a good idea of where we are in terms of our time frame. So if you look at this timeline, you see that the bottommost blue arrow goes from left to right, and we see that it is established at the beginning of the Christian era with the birth of Christ and the teachings of Christ. You'll see in 33 AD is roughly when we consider to be the death of Christ. That moves us into what we call the early Christian era. So this chapter is going to be focused on that sort of leftmost part of what says the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And that's going to be important for us to remember. At this point in Europe, there's one Christian church, and it's called the Catholic Church. Now, its procedures and teachings are a little bit different than modern-day Catholicism, what you might associate with the Roman Catholic Church. It is still based in Rome and will form the foundation of the modern-day Roman Catholic Church. But its teachings, its ideas, a little bit different. It will take Catholicism and Christianity in general a few centuries really to sort out exactly what its tenets are, what's going to be finalized in their editions of the Bible, and what we're going to see in this chapter is the beginning of the development of Christian art and how Christians begin to negotiate their identity in this vast Roman region after the collapse of the empire overall. So as you look at these dates that go on to the right, with the rule of Justinian, that's going to coincide with the Byzantine era, which we'll be looking at in a future time period. Then, of course, we'll have the birth and life of the Prophet Muhammad, which will bring Islam into the region. This will, of course, sort of change the political and religious landscape of the entire world, really, which will eventually lead, after many centuries, to what we call the Great Schism. And you see that on the timeline here. The Great Schism is in 1054, and that will be the official point that Christianity no longer is considered one church, but will be split into at least two, with the Roman Catholic tradition and the Orthodox tradition. So I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but I want to keep in mind and have you guys understand where we are in the timeline of European Christian history here. So as we consider this, we want to remind ourselves that during the 3rd and 4th centuries, there was a rapid number of Romans who will reject traditional polytheism, the traditional gods and goddesses of Rome, in favor of monotheism, which simply means the worship of one God. In this process of rejecting the polytheistic and embracing the monotheistic, they're still creating artwork, and that's going to be the crux of what we're looking at this week. Alright, so of course I always like to start with a map just to keep us, remind us where we are geographically. We'll be beginning by looking at a few places over in Dura Europus, which is way over in modern-day Syria on the right-hand side of the map. And that's where we're going to see a few early pieces of Christian art alongside early, well, not early, but contemporaneous synagogue art as well. Then we'll be moving steadily westward. As you move through Turkey, you'll see where Constantinople, this will become the capital city of Byzantium, which we'll look at later on. Then as we march ever further westward, of course, we'll see Rome in Italy, which will become the capital of Christianity in the western part of Europe. As you look north in Germany, you'll see the city of Trier. And I mentioned that one briefly last week when we talked about the end of the Roman Empire and how the empire had been split up into tetrarchs under the rule of the Tetrarchy. One of the capital cities was way up there in Trier, Germany. So keep in mind, we'll be moving across the Mediterranean and up into Western Europe. And as we move through this week, next week, and the week after, what we're really going to be looking at is the development of medieval empires and kingdoms across this entire region. So we'll begin this week looking at some finds that we have in Dura Europus over modern-day Syria. Now, Dura Europus, your book talks a little bit about its history and who founded it and so on. It was basically during the Roman Empire, a Roman garrison town. So this was a station with a lot of Roman soldiers and business going through it. What's really fascinating about it is that we have lots of houses of worship and cult buildings in this city that have remained pretty much intact, very well preserved. What we're looking at here is the interior of a synagogue at Dura Europus. So right in the center of this image, of this wall, you see a little niche. In that niche, most likely would have been placed a copy of the Torah, the Holy Book of Judaism, would have been placed right there, and this would have been where the local congregation of Jews would have come on Sabbath and holy days to pray. And as we look around, we'll see all of these really amazing murals, very brightly colored. There's not a lot of action, quote unquote. These are generally just figures who are standing in rather posed, stylized gestures. There's not a lot of dynamic motion or movement. Now, we feel that these probably had a didactic purpose. They were a teaching tool to help the congregation learn about the stories of the Torah and the names and the important places associated with Jewish history. This is pretty significant for a couple of reasons. Jews have had a very difficult time under the reign of the Roman Empire. At best, Jewish populations were tolerated. At worst, they were exiled and persecuted and enslaved. They have a very aggressive history with Rome. Rome has a very aggressive history with the Jewish populations in its empire. So the fact that we have in Dura Europus at this time apparently a stable and respected enough community that they're allowed to have this sacred space and have it decorated, and that they have enough resources at hand to create a space like this tells us something about the Jewish community in this particular town, that they did have at least some numbers to give them some respect, and they must have had a fairly good relationship with the local community. Now, in Dura Europus at the same time, there are also many people who are polytheistic, who follow the Roman gods and goddess, and there are also going to be a fair number of Christians who will populate this region as well. Now, during the first couple centuries of Christianity, which is contemporaneous with what we're looking at in the synagogue, what we're going to notice is a lot of Christian iconography that will borrow very, very heavily from Jewish iconography and Jewish symbolism. These two faiths will have a great deal in common with each other during these first couple centuries of Christianity's development, until Christianity really develops an iconography all unto its own. So we'll see lots of crossover in terms of style and iconography and symbolism associated with early Christian worship and Jewish worship in the early Christian era. So as I mentioned, there were Christian communities also in Dura Europos. And what we're looking at here is a floor plan of a Christian community house from that region. Now, before the rule of Constantine in the Roman Empire, Christianity was illegal for some of that time. Christians were being persecuted, as were Jews and other people who did not abide by the Roman faith. So many of these communities found themselves having to worship in small enclaves, sort of hidden away. And we're going to see a lot of Christian iconography will begin to develop in this secretive environment. Now, as I mentioned with the Jewish population at Dura Europos has a little bit more unique community in that we already saw we have a very elaborately decorated synagogue, and we also see Christian houses of worship that will be a little bit more elaborately done, suggesting that these groups may have had a little bit more freedom over here in Syria than they would have had closer to Rome and over in the west. At any rate, let's take a look at what we see here. Many early Christian worship spaces were homes. They were private homes of people who had converted to Christianity that were just being used as worship spaces, because most Christian communities during these first couple centuries simply did not have the resources to build a special building for a church. So there would often be a courtyard area that would serve as a community center of sorts, a meeting area. There would often be a side room of the house, and you can see it in this diagram, that would serve as a baptistry, so Christians could undergo the rite of baptism as well. We'll see different kinds of decoration in these homes. Some will doubtlessly be very familiar iconography if you're familiar at all with Christian art. Some might be a little bit surprising to you in terms of the symbolism that's being used. It's a very dynamic time in terms of Christian era art because there is no unified central Christian authority. At this time, before Constantine, there's no one person who's the head of the Christian church. There are people of various position and status and power, but we don't have that central authority that can sort of dictate what Christian art should look like, what Christians should be preaching or practicing. And so we're seeing just the formations of an organized religion beginning to build at this time. So as we look at this scene, let's sort of remind ourselves of the place of Christians within the modern and medieval world. So if you remember back to the beginning of the Roman Empire, Augustus reorganized Rome into an empire. Christians were around then. Christianity existed at the time. But throughout Rome, they were a very tiny minority sect. And there were one little religion amongst hundreds of religions that were practiced throughout the vast and mighty Roman Empire. In Rome itself, in the city of itself, many citizens followed Egyptian cults of Osiris and others. Egyptian cults were quite a faddish sort of thing to follow in the city of Rome itself. So long as these cults, whether it was a cult to Osiris or whether it was a Christian sect, so long as those smaller religions did not interfere with the Roman state, for the most part, the Roman state was tolerant of them. Where Christianity becomes persecuted and where Christians come into conflict with the Roman authority is when Jesus instructed his followers not to worship the emperor. Jesus also challenged established Jewish tradition, causing rifts between his followers and the leading Jewish authority. And this is where we're going to see, historically, the split in Christianity away from Judaism. Christianity is you want to consider it in the same continuity of Judaism, but because Jesus challenged many of the old standing traditions and authority of old Jewish law, that's going to cause this rift that's going to allow Christians and Jews to consider themselves two different faiths, with many connections to each other, of course, but a split occurs because of that teaching. The reason that Christians get persecuted by the Romans is simply because the Christians refuse to bow down before the emperor and treat the emperor as a god figure. Jews also suffer persecution because of that same reason. Jews also refuse to worship the emperor as a god, and they will also be persecuted for that. The Roman government will repeatedly try to get Christians to conform to Roman tradition. They do this through force, exile, torture, threat of execution, and it doesn't really work, however. Many new Christians will be converted, and the Roman authorities will eventually have Jesus arrested and crucified, and that's the story of the crucifixion, the passion of the Christ, is when the Roman authorities decide that the only way they're going to deal with this annoying little sect of Christians is to kill Jesus. That doesn't work out too well for them either. So what we want to consider with all this is that Christianity was banned in the empire. It was illegal to be a Christian in the empire until 313 CE or AD, depending on the numbering system you use. It was illegal to practice or promote the teachings of Christianity during this time. So before legalization, Christians promoted their ideas through a highly symbolic representation. Christianity didn't go away, it just went underground. And that's what we're seeing in this image. And this is literally underground. It's a catacomb. So this is a burial place, an underground, and what we're looking at is the ceiling of the catacomb, where we're going to see a few different scenes. In the very center rondel, we'll see the Good Shepherd. So that's a fairly common representation of the idea of Jesus. Now, as you look at this image, this is supposed to be a symbolic representation of Jesus Christ. You'll notice that there are no angels around him. He has no halo. He's not in heaven. There's no throne. There's no glory of heaven. And that is because at the time that this is being made, Christianity is still illegal. And you could be persecuted if you are a Christian or if you show Christian iconography. So instead, we're using this much more subtle imagery. Christ is described by his followers as being a shepherd of men, and Christians are the sheep that follow the good shepherd. So we'll see many representations of a young man with sheep, with that idea of the shepherd being a stand-in for Christ. There's also, within this scene on the ceiling, you see the story of Jonah. Jonah and the whale. If you're familiar with that story at all, you know that Jonah gets swallowed up by a whale. He's in the belly of the beast for 3 days, and then he gets spit out by the whale. And we'll see that as a scene that turns up a lot in this period of early Christian art. Again, this is used symbolically, allegorically, in terms of Jonah is a stand-in for Christ. Christians believe that Christ died on the cross, and then 3 days later was resurrected. Jonah was swallowed up by the monster, and then 3 days later he was spit out, and he came back. So it's a stand-in. You'll notice a couple of other figures who are standing within the circle who have their hands out to their sides, and their fingers open to their sides. That's called an orant pose. And those orants, that is a pose of prayer. So we're clearly wanting to indicate that these are holy spaces, that these are religious figures, because we have the orant poses. What we're going to see is this use of very abstract symbolism, a good shepherd, the story of Jonah, things that can be used symbolically to represent Jesus Christ and the teachings of Christianity without blatantly calling it Jesus, without blatantly calling it Christianity. And we're doing that again just to try to keep the community of Christians safe from persecution. So we're going to continue to see this tradition of using Jewish and other sources as symbolism in early Christian art throughout this early Christian era. Now, Christians are beginning to codify the Bible at this point. So I'm talking about the Christian Bible and how it came to be the book that people recognize today. Essentially what happens is that the Hebrew Torah and other Jewish writings become designated as what we now call the Old Testament, in contrast to Christian writings, which will become what we call the New Testament. So from the very beginning, we see Christians putting themselves in continuity with Judaism by taking the Torah and other important Jewish writings and sort of putting that in a package that becomes the first half of the Christian Holy Book. Then the story of Jesus' life and Jesus' teachings becomes the second half of the book in the New Testament. Now, there's a lot of different reasons why we're doing this in the early Christian era. First of all, because Jesus was Jewish, and many of the very first Christians were also converted Jews. But also, Christians came to view many of the persons and events in the Old Testament as what we call prefigurations of the New Testament. So a prefiguration is when we take a story like Jonah and the whale, for example, and we use it to symbolize something that occurs in the New Testament, like Jesus' resurrection from the tomb. So I already spoke a little bit about that in the previous slide. And that's where we're getting this idea from. Christians are looking to the Torah, they're looking to old Jewish writings, and they're reading it symbolically and saying, look, Jonah's entombment in the whale mirrors Christ's entombment and resurrection. And so we're going to look back and forth and see those connections there. The story of Adam and Eve. When Eve takes of the forbidden fruit, it throws humanity out of the Garden of Eden. That is what Christians call the original sin. And it's Jesus's death on the cross that redeems humanity for that original sin. And so we see a scene from the Old Testament, from Jewish writings and Jewish belief that is being continued in the New Testament in Christian ideas and Christian belief. This whole biblical interpretation is called typology, and it's established in Christianity from a very early time. So let's see where we can see that here. On this scene, in this sarcophagus, really beautifully carved marble sarcophagus. I just want to point out briefly the figures and the style with which this is carved. We see that late Roman Empire sort of look that we saw last week, with heads that are a little too big, bodies that are a little stunted, arms and legs. It's all just a little bit awkward and a little bit stiff. And very reflective of this instability in society at the time. And very much will be the style that early Christians pick up on. These are not the classic, Greek classicism, Roman verism. This is a very abstracted sort of style that's going to become important to early Christianity. So on the left-hand side of the sarcophagus, you see a man laying down on the ground while this really awesome-looking sea serpent comes up out of the water. That's Jonah, and the sea serpent is actually supposed to be a whale. It's a wonderful interpretation of that idea. So we have the prefiguration of Christ's resurrection there. Immediately to the right of Jonah, we have a figure, an orant pose, in front of a tree. So we already discussed how the orant was a prayer pose. It indicates a sacred significance. The tree is significant. Now, what we're looking at with a lot of this early Christian art, so far we have seen no crucifixions. We have seen no crosses. Those sorts of symbols are ubiquitous in Christianity now. However, during the first few centuries of the Christian era, there are no crucifixion scenes. There are no crosses. That is not a symbol that gets associated with Christianity until later. What we're seeing with this prayer, this orant pose in front of a tree, the tree is a symbolic referent to the cross because the cross was made out of wood. So it's the living embodiment because trees are living things. It's the living embodiment of Jesus' death. So it's a wonderful little symbolism there. So we're not going to see a cross there. We are going to see that tree. To the right of the tree is what we call a philosopher, a person with a scroll reading. That's indicating the importance of the written text, the Torah, the Ten Commandments, and the foundation of Christian law. To the right of that, we see again another good shepherd, a man holding a sheep. And to the right of that, we see a man and a child going into a river. This is most likely referring to the baptism of Jesus in the River Jordan with John the Baptist. But in all of this, again, there are no halos, there are no angels, there are no crosses. There's nothing to make it obvious to a viewer that this is a Christian scene. It's all done symbolically, it's all done much more subtly, and we're doing it this way again to try to keep our community safe from persecution. We'll see a similar narrative here in this sarcophagus, the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus. Now your book describes this in some detail, so I don't want to repeat what's in your book. I'll just cover a few little things here. First of all, the carving on this is absolutely fantastic. There's some beautiful craftsmanship in here, wonderful depth in this high relief. This is clearly a sarcophagus of somebody of extremely high status and class to be able to afford such an exquisite work of art. It's also indicative to us that even though Christianity is a little bit underground at this time and is not the established religion at this time, there's still quite a market for this, and we do see in these sorts of representations people from higher classes, those patrician level classes, who are converting to Christianity. Part of the reason that the Roman Empire and the Roman government was so threatened by Christianity is because it spread so very rapidly, primarily through the lower plebeian classes. And this makes a certain amount of sense if you understand the theology. If you look at classic Roman polytheism, essentially, and this is a generalization of course, but essentially whatever your status or rank in society was in this worldly life, when you pass on to the afterlife, that was going to be your rank and status in the afterlife. If you were a wealthy patrician in the Roman era and you worshipped Jupiter and all the appropriate gods, when you passed on to the afterlife, you were going to enjoy that elevated status. Unfortunately, if you were a lowly plebeian, if you were somebody of a very low rank in society, you probably didn't have much to look forward to in the afterlife. Now here comes along Christianity, preaching things like the meek shall inherit the earth, and preaching these ideas that it does not matter what your rank or status is in this worldly life. Anyone who is virtuous and who abides by these rules of Christianity can achieve everlasting life and so on. This is a very powerful message for the lower classes of Rome. And we see Christianity just explodes amongst the plebeian population. And that is another major reason why the Romans come down so hard on Christianity. It's because it just catches on like wildfire amongst these lower classes. Eventually, though, it moves up the social rank to guys like Junius Bassus and people of the higher echelons of Roman society. And because they have the money, they get the more extravagant pieces here. So as we take a look at this, we'll see episodes from Hebrew scriptures, including Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, and those sorts of prefiguration scenes appear side by side with representations of Jesus. So right in the center of the sarcophagus on the upper register, we see a representation of Jesus Christ. He has long hair but no beard. He's clean shaven, and we have this representation of him as being very youthful. And you'll see this peculiar thing. I'll draw your attention to it. We see Christ enthroned. He's a very young man in this enthronement. His feet are on a head that's underneath his throne. That's a Roman sky god. That is a polytheistic Roman god there, and Christ has his feet on top of that Roman god's head. On either side of Christ are the saints Peter and Paul. So that's really extremely powerful symbolism, as you might imagine, and it's certainly how Christians are trying to see themselves, surmounting Roman polytheism. We also see some scenes of Adam and Eve, some other elements from Hebrew scripture, the scene of Jesus entering Jerusalem on a donkey, all kinds of these scenes that are just beginning to be codified and spread as a part of the early message of Christianity. So we have a pretty bold scene with Christ enthroned with his feet on top of a Roman god's head. Still, no crosses, no halos, no angels. There's still a very grounded approach to the holy figure. This will all change as Christianity becomes established and starts to gain more authority and power within the region. So we'll take a quick look at a couple of freestanding statues depicting similar ideas. More Good Shepherd scenes. So this piece is about 3 feet tall, carved out of marble, beautifully done. Really love the detail in the lamb itself over this guy's shoulders. It is a Good Shepherd scene meant to be a symbolic representation of Jesus. And again, I know I sound a bit like a broken record, but again, no halos, no heavenly host, a very simplistic and youthful representation of Jesus in this way. Here's another example, not as a shepherd this time, but as a seated figure, probably in what we'd consider a philosopher's pose. Again, we'll notice and this is something to pay attention to as we look at the development of Christian art, how Jesus himself is embodied throughout the ages. In this early Christian era, he's a youthful man, no beard, long hair, wearing a sort of Greek or Eastern style tunic, and sandals, and this is how he will be represented during this era. We won't see the development of Jesus with the beard and the halo and some of those accoutrements until much later on. So this statue was probably commissioned by recent converts to Christianity. If you were a person who had the money, the means, and you converted to Christianity, you might show that devotion by commissioning one of these small pieces to be made and placed near or inside of your home for worship and to just show your devotion. So as long as we're talking about early Christian symbolism, I thought I'd take a moment to address this symbol, the ichthys, or fish symbol. So this is a symbol that was developed in the very earliest centuries of Christianity during the period of time that Christians are being actively persecuted by the Romans. And this becomes a way that Christians identify themselves to each other secretly as a part of a secret symbolic language. I thought I'd include it in this lecture because this is a very common and popular image today. You may have seen this as a bumper sticker on the back of cars or on jewelry, so it's a symbol that's still around, even though it's a very old symbol. So it's a very simple fish drawing, as you can see. And this would have been used by early Christians to help identify each other and to indicate to other Christians who may be sort of living underground, and you have to be careful not to identify yourself as Christian or you could be arrested. And so they developed this sort of neutral symbol of the fish that's not super obvious. It's not a cross. It's not a crucifix. Those symbols won't be used by Christians until much later. It's this neutral, subtle symbol. It's very easy to draw. You don't have to be an artist to knock out a simple little fish symbol. And Christians might paint this on the side of their house, or use it as a marker to indicate that this is a safe area for Christians to gather. Instead of putting a great big cross on the front of a building, there might be a very small little drawing of a fish to indicate that this is a place of worship and Christians can gather here. And so it becomes this way of Christians identifying each other using a secret language. So on the graphic you can also see why is it a fish? Why do they use fish symbols? Ichthys is the Greek word for fish, and it's a clever little word play going on here. If you say the phrase Jesus Christ, God's Son and Savior, in Greek, and you take the first letter of all of those Greek words and put them together, it's what you see here. That is ichthys, and that means fish. So it's actually kind of clever when you think about it in that way. So I'm not going to go on too much about this. I just thought I would include that in this portion of the lecture, since it's an ancient, it's an early Christian symbol that seems to still resonate today, and it's something many Christians today still use to identify themselves. An interesting connection to the earliest parts of the faith. So now let's consider what happens once Christianity becomes legitimized. And by legitimized, all I mean is that it becomes legal, and then it becomes the official state religion within the Roman Empire. Once Christians are able to practice their faith openly, and once it finally gains official government support and government resources, it's only at that point that we see the building of separate churches that are no longer in Christians' homes. They're actually separate buildings out in the community. So very early Christian churches were based on the Basilican plan that we saw last time. So this is a Roman style of architecture that was used for civic buildings and public spaces. And early Christian churches will basically use that exact same architectural plan. So this is an elevation diagram of Old St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, and it's one of our earliest Christian churches that we can look at. The scheme of it is pretty typical. We'll see this same Basilican plan develop for the next several centuries throughout European Christianity. The central main space is called the nave. It leads up to a focus point in the church called the apse. There will be side aisles flanking the nave, clerestories and triforiums, and all of this fun architectural language that we get to talk about with early Christian churches. Let's take a look at the floor plan of St. Peter's. To modify the Basilican plan, many early Christian churches will add a transept to the plan to create what we call the Latin cross plan. So as you look at this floor plan here, you notice an atrium, which would be a large sort of outdoor courtyard. You would enter into the building proper through the narthex, that sort of entrance area. That will lead you into the nave. The nave leads us up towards the apse, but then intercepting the nave at a 90-degree angle will be that transept. So early Christian churches will have a short transept, and you can see where this is beginning to look a little bit like a cross. As we move on in later periods of time, that transept may become exaggerated so it looks much more like a cross with what you associate with the Christian symbol today. And we'll begin to see the development of these Christian symbols being added into the architecture itself to try to set these apart from their Roman pagan predecessors. And here's just a few more concept drawings of what the original St. Peter's might have looked like. That building was destroyed and rebuilt and renovated several times. St. Peter's is an extremely important place in Christianity. It is believed that St. Peter, the first Pope of Rome, St. Peter, who traveled with Jesus and was the inheritor of the power on earth, our first Pope, It's believed that he is buried directly underneath Old St. Peter's, under this cathedral, and that's extremely significant to early Christianity and remains extremely significant to the Catholic Church today. This is sort of the heart of the Vatican and the heart of where the modern day, the current Pope, resides and does a lot of his ritual activity. So here's an interior space that's still existent of one of these early types of churches. This is the interior of Santa Sabina in Rome, dating to about 422 AD, of course, CE. And what we'll notice in these churches is that it's still this basilican plan with very wide naves leading to side aisles, lots of verticality in terms of the height of the building with a flat roof, leading up to a decorated apse. So as we look towards the apse, and the apse in these early Christian churches is where the altar is going to be, and it's going to be the primary focal point for worship. And you can see there's a nice painted scene within that apse space. We're going to try to get as much light into these spaces as possible. So you see a big row of windows at the top there, and there are more windows in the aisles. That's going to be a difficulty for Christian churches throughout the medieval era all the way up through the Gothic era, is this desire to create very large extravagant spaces. But of course, without electricity, how do we get light in there? How do we illuminate them? That's going to be something that architects are going to struggle with. Lots and lots of marble. Right now, with this piece from the 5th century, we're not noticing a lot of spectacular decoration. There is some painting in the apse, but otherwise there are not a lot of statues, there are not a lot of other mosaics. It's relatively plain, and I just want to point that out at this point because that will change as we get closer to the Gothic. We'll start to see more decoration come into these spaces. Also, while many early Christian churches are basilican plan, we also have a little bit of variety there with what we'll call central plan churches. So this again is a way to try to differentiate Christian spaces from Roman or pagan spaces. So in this interior shot of Santa Costanza, also in Rome, you'll notice that this is a central plan where our apse is in the center of the space, and our nave, instead of being a long corridor leading from the narthex to the apse, is instead a circle that we call an ambulatory that goes all the way around the central space. Some of these central plan buildings can be extremely large, as we'll see, and it creates a different kind of environment where you have sort of an all-around approach with putting the center of worship, the altar, right in the heart of the building. There's an important symbolic idea with that as well. It also means that we can put a lot of the windows up high over the altar, like you see in Santa Costanza here, which can help illuminate that central space, dealing with the issue of illumination also. We will see some decoration in these kinds of spaces, and sometimes these also get used not just as churches, but as mausoleums and important ritual spaces beyond just being for worship. And here's just a quick look at a floor plan and elevation of Santa Costanza. Again, demonstrating to you what this central plan looks like. We do have a narthex over here. You can see in the lower image on the right-hand side that entranceway serves as a narthex, but instead of a straight shot nave, we have instead that ambulatory that curves all the way around. And then you can see how we have stairways that will take us up to the upper levels. So Santa Costanza originally served as a mausoleum for the daughter of Constantine. So she was related to Constantine, and so she had this very elaborate mausoleum space. It was later converted into a church, so it became a house of worship then. But as we're looking up in the ambulatory of Santa Costanza, we're looking up at the ceiling around the ambulatory, we see the decoration program in mosaic that wraps around the central altar. Many of these patterns in these mosaics are deriving from either early Christian iconography or they're deriving from older Roman iconography. So as we take a look here, we see a portrait of our lady who is buried here. We also see this elaborate harvest of grapes. We see some birds and putti and people in carts gathering wine and this harvest of grapes. This has a couple of different symbols. The inclusion of grapes and vineyards and vineyards and so on. Very, very common throughout Roman pagan art as an indication of a dedication to Dionysus. Dionysus was the god of wine and drinking and so on. So this may be a sort of holdover from that, but we want to consider this in terms of typology. We want to interpret this in a Christian way because this is a Christian sacred space. So we'll see Christians will adapt these symbols of Dionysus and including things like grapes and wine and the harvest of grapes. And though it will be used instead in a Christian interpretation as a symbol of the Eucharist. So the Eucharist in Christianity is when Christians take of wine and bread and they perform this sort of ritual prayer where they say these words that this is the body of Christ and the blood of Christ. Different Christian denominations have little different takes on this. The Eucharist is, of course, a big part of many different Christian denominations still today, and especially the Catholic Church is very steeped in the tradition of the Eucharist. So even though this inclusion of vines and grapes in the harvest has a connection to earlier Roman tradition, we want to read this in a Christian way, that this is most likely representing the continuity of the Eucharist within the Christian tradition. Here's a detail of one of those figures harvesting grapes, a couple of oxen and a cart. We'll just take a look at the style of representation. Again, it's a very abstract style, that sort of large head and stunted body. But we want to, again, read this scene symbolically through that typological lens that this is a Christian scene related to the Eucharist. This is from a different mausoleum space, and in this mosaic we see again the vine work indicating grapes and its possible association to Dionysus or Bacchus, but within a Christian typology, again, we want to read that as being a symbolic of the Eucharist in the Eucharist tradition. That central figure that's got some damage to it, but we can see a figure on a chariot being drawn by horses, and this is what we consider the Sol Invictus, which is a Roman personification of the sun that rides his chariot across the sky every day. It's the sun victorious here. But how we want to read this in terms of typology in a Christian context, and this is quite remarkable here in the 3rd century to see this. It's Sol Invictus, this Roman god of the sun, but notice the beams of light that emanate from Sol Invictus's head. Very much in a cross-like pattern. It's not a true cross. We can't see all of the arms of the cross, but we're clearly sort of evoking the idea of a cross with that pattern there. So we usually see this as an embodiment of Christ in the guise of Sol Invictus. So that's a really significant find for us. That as far as this very early Christian work goes, this is a very blatant symbol of Jesus and associating Jesus as a divine figure. But we're still blending him with Roman iconography, with the sun god and the bacchanal images of the vine work. but definitely a striking image to be sure. Here's another mosaic scene from the nave of Santa Maria Maggiore. This is also in Rome. And again, just very indicative of how these early Christian churches tended to be decorated with these really bright, vibrant mosaics. They're really fantastic. And your book describes in a little bit more detail how mosaics are made, the technique and the materials, so you can get that information from your textbook. In this image of the parting of Lot and Abraham, this is of course an Old Testament story. You'll notice on the left-hand side of the image you see a young child off by Abraham there. That's Isaac. That's Abraham's son Isaac. Now, at the time of the story of the parting of Lot and Abraham, Isaac had not been born yet, but the artist is including him in this scene because Isaac stands again as a prefiguration of Jesus. It's one of the many stories from the Old Testament that Christians will use as a symbolic representation of Christ. Isaac stands in for Christ in Christian typology. So again, we're going to see the inclusion of both Roman symbols, Sol Invictus, dedications to Bacchus in terms of wine, and those get interpreted through a Christian lens as being the Eucharist or as being Jesus instead of Sol Invictus. And we're also going to see the inclusion of Jewish symbolism and Jewish iconography with these old Jewish stories being included in Christian spaces as well. And that's really going to be the foundation of Christian art, the blending of all of these different traditions interpreted through a specific Christian lens. Now that we've seen some of the interior decoration, let's take a quick look at what some of these buildings look like from the outside. So this is the exterior of the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia over in Ravenna, Italy, coming from about 425. What you're going to notice right away, I hope, is how undecorated, unadorned this space is. It's a relatively simple central plan building with just brickwork and some tile work on the roof. There's no decoration, there are no paintings, there are no statues. It's very geometric, it's very flat, there's just not much going on. Now this is not because it's not because there's a lack of ability or a lack of skill. Clearly, we have some very talented artists. The reason the outside of these early Christian churches tend to be fairly plain looking has a lot to do with this early Christian theology. In that this idea that a sacred space is a space you cross from the mundane material world into the extravagant world of the divine. So the exterior of these buildings will very often be plain and simple, reflecting the sort of materialistic world that you live in during your life. And when you cross the threshold into the sacred space, that's where you'll see all of the beautiful mosaics and the shining statues and the gorgeous marble. And all of that is to represent the splendor of heaven and the splendor of God and so on. And I want to point that out and kind of make a big deal of how plain these buildings look here in the 5th century, because this attitude will change as Christianity becomes more established as a centralized church. Their doctrine on how they build their churches will change, and we'll begin to see these spaces get bigger and bigger and more complex and much highly decorated. So in a few weeks' time, when we get to Gothic cathedrals, compare this building to Notre Dame in Paris. There's no comparison. There will be such a radical shift in how Christians are defining their sacred spaces. It's really quite amazing. So that's the reason I'm sort of wanting to focus on that here, is that this is reflective in an early Christian idea of what this space should be and how it should contain those symbols. As Christianity develops, those ideas will change and the architecture will change with it. So while the exterior of Galla Placidia the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia, is very plain. The interior is not. And it's by this time, as you can see, 425, after Christianity becomes legitimized within the Roman Empire, and we see Constantine's effect on Christianity in the region, that we're getting much more obvious and blatant Christian symbolism that no longer has to be so subtle. It no longer has to be couched in allegory or symbolism. It could be much more obvious in what it's trying to say. So we see that in this example here. This again is Christ as the Good Shepherd. We've seen that before, but now this is radically different. So it's Christ as the Good Shepherd, but now he has a halo. Now he's holding, instead of a shepherd's crook, he's actually holding something with a cross on it, clearly identifying him as Christ. He's also wearing golden and purple robes. So that's very significant, of course. So it's interesting how in this time period, Christians are feeling open enough and comfortable enough to display these images of Christ that are much more blatant in terms of portraying Christ as a holy figure, as an important part of the worship in this space. So no longer is he just an anonymous shepherd. He's in golden robes, and he's carrying a cross, and he has a halo. And we're starting to see the develop of all of those things as well. We see he's in this kind of interesting landscape. And if you take a look at it, you can see that some of the animals and Christ himself have cast shadows. There is an attempt here to create a certain level of realism, to create a certain level of depth. It still reads to us today as a little bit abstract and a little bit flat, but there was an attempt to try to get some detail and some depth and some motion in the piece from those classical elements. So this is a very regal interpretation of this idea of the Good Shepherd. And I also want to point out that instead of carrying one of his sheep, Jesus sits amongst his flock. To his left and right, the sheep are distributed very evenly. We have two groups of three. Their arrangement is rather loose and informal. And you see in the background is this blue sky that covers the background of the piece. I do want to point out the groups of three is probably significant. Three is an important number in Christianity as a representation of the Trinity. So we'll see multiples of three are very, very common as well. But really quite remarkable. If you think back to our previous pieces that we saw earlier in this lecture, the Good Shepherd at the Catacombs we saw. That dates back to the early 4th century, so the early 300s. Within 100 years' time, from the 300s to the 400s, we go from very carefully having a anonymous shepherd that symbolically represents Jesus in a way that's not too specific, to this, where we have a Good Shepherd Jesus that is very obviously Jesus, very obviously a holy figure. And this is a huge shift, a radical change within, again, about 100 years. A very short period of time historically. Now we'll move over to Ravenna, Italy, and take a look at some of the early churches there. This is the Basilican plan church there that was established by Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths, who establishes his capital in Ravenna around the 490s AD. So this palace/church features extensive series of mosaics that you can see on either side of the nave here. It depicts both Hebrew prophets and scenes from the life of Christ. So again, we're using Hebrew stories and elements from the Torah as a prefiguration of Christian scenes. This is one of the mosaics that we see in that church, the Miracle of the Loaves and Fishes, which is a mosaic from the top register above the clerestory, and done around the year 504. And again, what a radical shift from those anonymous shepherds to this. There's Christ in the center, He's wearing gold and purple again. Those are the colors of the emperor, by the way, so very important symbolism there. Instead of a blue sky, he's got a golden background representing the glory of heaven. We see him performing the miracle of the loaves and fishes. He's still a young man. There's no beard. There's lots of emphasis on his youthfulness, and that's an important part of early Christian iconography. He's got a halo, and this, again, like in the Sol Invictus scene, we see a clear representation of a cross behind his head within that halo. So again, it's really radical, this shift and this change within a few generations of people to go from that very subtle symbolism to this very blatant iconography of Christ's divinity. And it's again indicative of how widely received Christianity is, the amount of resources at its disposal, and also indicative of its expanse into the upper classes. So Theodoric built this sacred space. He's in charge of the city. He's the king of the Ostrogoths. So he has at his disposal, excuse me, many resources, lots of money, lots of skilled labor, and he's putting it towards these kinds of buildings and these kinds of pictorial representations. So at this point, we've seen this very even shift away from the old Roman ideas, and clearly the central figures of authority and power and politics within what was once the Roman Empire have now become thoroughly Christianized. And Christianity is very much the religion of the empire at this point. As these Christian communities grow and develop and have at their fingertips more and more resources, we'll also see the development of illuminated manuscripts, which will illuminate books of the Gospels, Old and New Testaments, and so on. So this goes without saying, certainly, given the time period, but I do want to stress this, that these are all handmade. And if you want multiple copies of the Bible or multiple copies of just the Gospels, these all have to be done by hand. A person has to be trained in this art, in how to put the text down on the page, how to do it precisely and carefully, how to lay the page out. You have an illuminator, who's the person responsible for putting the illustrations into the manuscript. That's, again, a very specially trained person. So we'll see the development of communities of skilled laborers, skilled craftsmen, who are trained in the art of creating these sorts of texts. Any one of them, just a book of the Gospels, not even Old and New Testament together, just the 4 Gospels, it could take years, a couple of years, to produce just one of those books. So I do think it's important for us in the 21st century to remind ourselves when we look at these books, these were painstakingly done by hand. It would take years to accomplish one of these books. In our modern age, where we have just about any text ever made at our fingertips because of the digital era, we need to remind ourselves that these are precious objects. They are today still, and they certainly would have been at the time that they were created. So let's take a little bit of a look at this one. This is a really gorgeously painted book of Genesis. It's the oldest well-preserved manuscript that contains biblical scenes. It comes from the early 6th century. It's tempera, gold, and silver on purple vellum. So this is definitely a luxury item. A great deal of precious resources went into this piece. What we see depicted in the illumination at the bottom are 2 scenes of the Rebecca story in a single setting filled with classical motifs. So if you know the story of Rebecca, I won't recount the whole thing for you here. But we're seeing a continuous narrative. We have 2 scenes in the story of Rebecca unfolding within the same narrative space at the bottom here. And that'll be pretty common throughout these early illuminated manuscripts. Here's another example of a 6th century gospel being illuminated. This is telling the story of Christ before Pontius Pilate and his judgment, which will eventually lead to his death, to his crucifixion. We see Pilate enthroned at the top as he's passing judgment, and then in the bottom register we see Jesus. He's easy to pick out because he's wearing the golden robes and has a large halo. And this may be the first time we've seen Jesus represented with a beard, actually, in this piece. It's a little bit unusual for this time period. We'll take a look at the figures. They're a little bit more elongated, and there's some beautiful detail and shading within these pieces. That is something with illuminated manuscripts. We might see a little bit more variety of style, particularly during this early period, where artists are, you have one individual creating this one book, doing all the illuminations for this one book. You're going to see the artist's hand a little bit more freely, perhaps, than you would see in a mosaic or within a sculptural piece. We'll notice that all the figures are on a flat, plain background. In the bottom register, there is an attempt to put a ground line. It's a little haphazard, but we at least get a sense that our figures are standing on something. They're grounded in space. And we see that the text just sort of wraps around the scene. There's not a lot of clear structure of where the text needs to go and where the illustrations are. That will change as our techniques in making illuminated manuscripts become more sophisticated. We'll start to see that these workshops making these pieces will start to structure the page a little bit more evenly. We'll see a grid pattern put into place, but for right now, it sometimes looks a little bit haphazard, the way these images are floating in with the text. So we'll take a look at this piece. Is an ivory carving, and we haven't had a chance to talk much about ivory yet. Ivory was a very prestigious type of material, very much liked by the Romans throughout the empire. It's a very expensive material to have, so if you had an ivory artifact in your home, you displayed it with a great deal of pride. Early Christians are picking up on the potential for that material as well, and this scene is particularly important because it dates from about 420, and it's actually showing a crucifixion. And it may well be the earliest depiction of a crucifixion scene in Christian art. So quite significant in that. We'll notice that Jesus is indeed crucified. He's got the halo. He's still being represented as beardless and youthful. Also significant in this, on the left-hand side of the same panel, is the suicide of Judas. And it's kind of interesting that the artist has chosen to depict both of these scenes, both of these death scenes within the same register. As we take a look at the bodies, we'll notice that peculiar late Empire style of the sort of shortened bodies and stunted arms and legs and large heads in this very abstract but expressive style. Another important thing to note is that in the crucifixion scene itself, Jesus has his eyes open and is looking straight out at the viewer. So this is very much what we'll want to consider a transcendent pose. And crucifixion scenes in Christian art typically come in one of two different varieties. There's either a depiction of Christ transcendent or Christ suffering. And this one is clearly Christ transcendent. He shows no indication of pain or suffering. This is a spirit that has already transcended to heaven and has moved beyond that earthly realm. When we do see crucifixion scenes in this early part of Christianity, as rare as they are, when we do see them, they will usually focus on Christ transcending that agony, transcending that pain. It won't be till later on in the medieval era that we'll start to see this idea of Christ suffering becoming an important part of the iconography, and we'll discuss why that is when we get to it. Again, very interesting to have that juxtaposed against Judas and Judas's suicide. On the left-hand side, you can see beneath his feet the bag of money that he got from betraying Jesus. So an interesting combination, and you don't see that combination very often, with Judas, his suicide being put next to Jesus' sacrifice. In terms of style and technique, it's a deep relief carving, very nicely done, lots of fantastic detail, very dramatic poses of the other figures, telling this very poignant story. This would have been a part of a series that would have told the entire Passion of Christ, and your book describes what the Passion is, the different steps on the Passion, so this is a very important sequence within Christian iconography. This is another ivory piece, and it's indicative of an interesting change of events that occurs during the late Roman Empire and the early Christian era. The Emperor Theodosius banned all pagan cults in the year 391. Now that's pretty significant. So Christianity had been banned in the empire, and Christians had been persecuted. After the reign of Constantine, Christianity becomes legal. Then it becomes the official state religion. Then by 391, to be pagan is illegal. And while you don't necessarily have to be Christian, you kind of have to be Christian. That's sort of the default within the government at that time. But just because paganism gets banned, people don't stop being pagan. And what we have here is a work of art coming from this time period, about the year 400, done in a classical style, showing a woman sacrificing at an altar, performing a pagan rite, a pagan ritual. So this would have been used within a household of a family that still abided by the old traditional polytheistic ways, and probably had a small altar within their home for their dedications and sacrifices and so on. So it's an interesting turn of events, and it's also interesting in terms of its representation. So we've been looking at these Christian images where the figures are abstract and sort of oddly shaped, but within the pagan community that still exists in this area, we see they're maintaining that classical tradition of naturalism and realism in the body and proportion. So our knowledge on how to create the body naturalistically, realistically, that hasn't gone away. Artists still know how to do it. It's simply not what the Christians want, and it's not how the Christians want to represent their ideas of the divine. Pagans will still hang on to this for as long as they can, although eventually the Christian Church, the Catholic Church, will become quite harsh on people who don't agree to convert to Christianity a little bit later on. For a short while at least, we do get this continuity of faiths alongside each other, where pagans and Christians and Jews and so on will be able to worship side by side within these regions for at least a short period of time. So I want to conclude this week by showing you this timeline again, to just situate ourselves in terms of where we are chronologically. So we've been looking at that early Christian era for the first few centuries of Christianity, and we ended up this week looking at some artwork after Christianity becomes legitimized, becomes official, and begins to spread along official lines of the Roman Empire. At this point, just to reiterate, there really only is one denomination of Christianity, and we're going to see that develop further in the city of Rome, where Rome will be the center of Christian ideology and the Christian faith. Next week, when we start talking about Byzantium and the rule of Justinian, what we're going to see is a shift of Christian ideas and the Christian center of the church being moved out of Rome and over to the east, over to Constantinople. which will be the capital of the Byzantine Empire. This will eventually lead to a rift in Christianity, where we'll see the split between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Christian Church. But we'll want to consider that when Byzantium's golden age occurs, there's still culture in Rome, and there's still Christianity in Rome. And the differences in culture between Byzantium and Rome will eventually lead to that split, that east-west schism that will break the church at that time. We'll also, within a couple of weeks, start talking about the Prophet Muhammad and the development of Islam. Because once Islam begins spreading in the east and comes up against the Byzantine Empire, this will radically shift the politics and dynamics of Europe and the spread of Christianity across Eastern and Western Europe, and will create an interesting sort of political dynamic between what eventually comes to the Orthodox Christians and the Catholic Christians. But again, not to get too far ahead of myself, do keep this timeline in the back of your mind. I think it will help you keep these dates straight and to understand the continuing evolution of iconography and symbolism in the artwork that we're going to be looking at over the next few chapters. So with that being said, that's all for this week. If you have any questions or concerns, make sure that you're emailing me as soon as you can. My email address can be found on the Blackboard site. So with that, thank you guys very much, and talk at you later.